Hello, my name is Tosca Bruno van Vijveken, and today I'm undertaking a brief interview with Ignacio Saiz, the Executive Director of the Center for Economic and Social Rights, or CESR for short. Thank you, Ignacio, for allowing us to interview you today. This will be helpful. In this first interview, I want to ask you a couple of questions about the types of issues that your organization and you as a leader deal with. First, for everybody's understanding, what is the nature and mission of CESR, the Center for Economic and Social Rights?
The Center for Economic and Social Rights is an international NGO that works for the recognition and the enforcement of these rights, of economic and social rights, in countries around the globe. We have seen tremendous progress in the recognition of these rights, both at the international level and in national level constitutions. But still, their implementation and actual enforcement and reflection in public policy is still a challenge that is very elusive.
Could you just for our audiences explain what types of rights are covered under economic and social rights in a concrete way?
Sure. Economic and social rights are part of the full human rights agenda. They refer to the rights related to the ability of people to live an adequate standard of living and to live a life in dignity. So, for example, the right to health, the right to education, the right to housing, the right to water and sanitation, rights related to labor and employment, both the right to work and also rights at work. And they're often grouped with cultural rights, which are rights relating to specific cultural groups and often rights of a more collective nature.
Now, how did you as a person first become interested yourself in transnational activism, if you will?
I guess my first engagement was around issues to do with Latin America, where from a very young age, particularly from when I was a student, I became very interested and motivated by developments that were happening in Central and South America, efforts to conclude the conflicts in the region and efforts to promote democratization in the region. So I guess my first professional engagement with that was in working in human rights research and advocacy on Central America, firstly with small groups based in Europe, and secondly with Amnesty International, an organization with which I worked for many years.
I see, and we'll be talking about your career in the other interview in a moment. Now, when you think about CESR and your leadership, what do you feel currently are your top 3 challenges as an organization that you're facing, and how is CESR dealing with those?
I think challenges break down into external ones and internal ones. I mean, in terms of external challenges, I would say that a critical challenge right now is the impact and implications of the global economic crisis, which clearly is a human rights crisis and a crisis of economic and social rights. If you look at the numbers of people that have been rendered unemployed or whose working conditions have suffered as a result, the staggering increase in the number of predicted number of malnourished children and malnourished people as a direct result of the crisis. And yet the crisis is not being dealt with in human rights through a human rights lens. Responses are very often willfully, I think, ignorant of or disregarding of human rights principles. Principles such as the concern for the most disadvantaged and marginalized, the obligations of states to marshal whatever resources they have according to certain priorities and principles. And we're seeing in a range of spheres, both in terms of cuts to social spending, declines in social protection, the refusal to implement fiscal measures or tax reforms that are equitable and that don't impact on the most disadvantaged disproportionately. We are shocked to see that around the world the responses to the crisis are really not complying with these human rights principles. That I would say is one of the key external challenges. Perhaps I think your question was more about perhaps the internal challenges facing the organization.
Also.
I mean, one key internal challenge for an organization is, for a small organization like ours, is how really to to be very clear about its comparative advantage, to be very clear about its mission and its value added in an increasingly populated sphere, which is human rights advocacy. It can only be a good thing that there are more organizations working globally and nationally on issues of human rights, but it also demands that we be very clear about how we can make a unique contribution and work in partnership and in close synergy with other organizations. There's always the danger of duplication of missions if organizations are working too much in their own silos. But a particular challenge for a small organization is really how to leverage its competencies and its minimal resources to maximum effect. And we are constantly facing choices of this kind, strategic choices on a daily basis, as to how, for example, how reactive we can be to a new opportunity or a request that emerges for our help, versus how focused we should be on our agreed strategic priorities. These tightropes and balances are very difficult to walk.
I
sometimes.
see. Well, my next question then leads nicely, takes over from there, if you will, is how does CESR define effectiveness? How do you know when you're effective? How do you assess that? How do you measure it? And maybe if I can tie to that also, I know that you're undertaking a lot of work as an organization on the measurement, quantitative as well as qualitative, of fulfillment or lack of fulfillment of economic and social rights. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that too.
Sure. I guess the ultimate measure of an organization's success has to be the extent to which it results in people enjoying their rights to a greater extent than they did before the organization's intervention or before the organization's work. That would be the ultimate measure.
Yeah.
However, we know that in human rights practice, it's often very difficult to attribute that degree of causality, in a way, to the results of an organization's work. And so we have tried to identify and set measures or metrics, if you like, of our own success, which look not only at the impact on that ultimate level of impact, but also ways in which we can have an impact on other actors who are in a position, whether it be policymakers or other civil society actors, to also promote the cause of human rights, and so fulfill that ultimate goal in a more indirect way. And I think most organizations who are concerned about assessing their impact, try and combine those measures of ultimate impact with more indirect measures. I would say that CESR's role is both to influence policymakers directly, but also to work with civil society activists to enable and empower people to run with the concepts and principles of economic and social rights, and to turn those principles into concrete instruments of advocacy, practical tools for which to demand accountability from the authorities, whether at the local level or at the national level, or indeed in international spaces. And so some of the indicators or metrics that we use to gauge our success are how much have we succeeded in the tools, for example, the methodological tools that we're devising, being used by others, being accessed, being found helpful, and there are quantitative as well as qualitative ways in which you can measure that degree of effectiveness.
I see. When it comes to leadership skills, since you are the executive director after all, and you've also had leadership positions in Amnesty at various levels, what does it take to be an effective leader in a human rights organization like CESR? How would you define what it means to be a good leader in your type of organization?
I think a good leader, good leaders that I would see as models or aspire to learning from would be those that have a clear vision and have the ability to implement that vision and to gather a team behind them or around them, in front of them, in order to implement that vision and see it fulfilled. I think some of the skills and attributes of a good leader that are somehow undervalued or often undervalued in the NGO sector are those of simply good management, ability to plan and prioritize, and to be able to lead processes of planning and prioritization. The concern for administrative aspects, internal aspects of an organization, making sure that an organization has sound, for example, human resource policies, hiring policies, or working practices that reflect and embody and model the human rights values that we espouse externally. I think this is, I would value those attributes alongside the need for vision and strategic sensibility. I think a good leader is also one that is able to guide an organization and ensure that priorities are adhered to, but at the same time is able to seize strategic opportunities as they arise, and to strike that balance successfully between pragmatism and it's leadership and management is all about walking tightropes.
Yes. Now, I will finish up with a question or two about your particular stay here at the Transnational NGO Initiative. So you have been our NGO fellow for this spring semester, and you came here to research a particular organizational challenge that you are facing. Tell us a little bit about that topic.
Sure. CSR is in a stage of evolution. We're very lucky to be able to say that, and of consolidation of its both of its strategic mission and purpose, but also of its staff team. And in that spirit, I was keen to use this time here at Syracuse to reflect on a question that's been challenging us, I think, for a number of years, around the kind of organization that CSR eventually wants to be. I've characterized the question, or the problem, if you like, the dilemma, as one of think tank versus advocacy network. To what extent, or where does CSR sit on the spectrum between what might be characterized as a think tank outfit and a more advocacy-oriented organization? In fact, over the last week and a half, as I've been reading extremely interesting literature on these issues and on related issues, I think that the question maybe is framed wrongly. I think we are neither a think tank nor an advocacy network. Right? It's been interesting to read the literature around what those types mean, and to try and position CSR, while at the same time I think we have attributes of both. And I also question to what extent these are polar opposites, or to what extent an organization could combine elements of both, as I think we do. I think an underlying issue which has come to the surface for me during my stay here has been that at the heart of this problem is the question of the relationship between the global and the local, the relationship between or the kinds of relationships that global organizations, or organizations with global pretensions, if you like, or an international perspective, the relationships that they have with national level advocacy and partnerships. And I think this is a very interesting time to be looking at these questions, because I think, and this is what I'm picking up also from the literature as well as from my own experience, I think patterns of organizing are changing, dynamics of organization are changing, not least due to the revolution in communications, which means that information flows in different ways, discussions happen in different ways, decisions get taken, and therefore partnerships emerge in more fluid and varied ways than perhaps they did before. We're very interested, we will always be an organization that works in partnership with national level actors, even though we are an international NGO. Our global advocacy will always be informed by experience at the national level. And we need to be very sensitive to the division of labor that is correct and appropriate between an international NGO and a national NGO, particularly when one is working at a national level and doing national level advocacy.
And to finish up on that is, you've spent about 1.5 to 2 weeks with us. When we think about a fellowship program like this for NGO leaders, what element has proven to be most useful to you?
I have really valued the literature searches that the students were able to do, and the fact that they were able to do that before I arrived, which meant that I could plunge myself into the literature and almost sift through what I thought might be more relevant and less relevant. And I deeply appreciate the work that they did in that respect, and I think that's very valuable for any future fellow. I also appreciated the interaction with students, and I think even though there's an issue of time in that as a fellow you can't spend too much time in classes or in interactions, some of the interactions I've had with the students here, particularly the students working on this project, have been very insightful for me, because even some of the questions that are asked have often led me to frame the problem that I'm researching in a different way, or even to identify the problem. And so that's very valuable. That interaction is extremely valuable. Just the access also to, the ability to detach to some extent from the day-to-day work, and to allow yourself, to give yourself license in a way to read, to dip into academic work, which sometimes feels like a luxury in the NGO world. But I'm absolutely convinced that it's necessary for NGO leaders to do this and to permit themselves the time to do so. It's very important in terms of that that leadership role and that strategic role that I was discussing earlier.
I could see what you mean, yeah. Well, thank you very much for this interview.
You're welcome.